Hello and welcome to another episode of Laptop Retrospective, and this is a Dell Latitude 3500. What makes this so interesting is not the design, or the screen, the size, or anything that's really happening that's exciting, except for the price of these on the used market. So these are about $250 to $300 US, and that's not too bad for 8th generation Intel. So let's just dive right into this. What we have is a 15.6-inch display laptop with numpad and a few other more basic business features. Let's start with the display. It's unfortunately the weakest component because all of the panels that are available for this are TN, no IPS, sorry. So you have a 1366 by 768 220 nit, a 1920 by 1080 220 nit, a 1920 by 1080 touch TN panel, 220 nit, and that one comes with an infrared camera and a dual microphone array. So we can tell by looking up at the top of this one that it is not an IR camera, so we know that it's going to be the either 1366 by 768 or the 920 by 1080 panel. CPUs in these varied considerably from a Intel Celeron to an i3, which this one is, two i5s, and then an i7. Now, depending on what CPU you got, it was either Intel UHD 620 graphics or, on some models, a GeForce MX 130 2 gigabyte card was available. Obviously, on the lower end CPUs, the GeForce was not an option. RAM on the inside is 32 gigs of DDR4 2400 megahertz RAM, and it is socketed, so you can put 2 sticks of 16 in there. Your backlit keyboard was optional, so do be paying attention for pictograms to indicate whether or not your device actually comes with one. Drives are either a SATA hard disk drive or an M.2 2280 NVMe. And you had two battery options, a 42 watt hour, which was a 3-cell, or a 4-cell 56 watt hour. With that quick rundown being over, let's go ahead and take a look at the ports that you get with this plastic fantastic. So on the left-hand side here, we have the charging port, USB Type-C, 3.1 Gen 1, HDMI 1.4b. We do have a network RJ45 Ethernet port. We have two USB 3.0 and a headphone microphone combo jack. And then on the right-hand side, we have a Kensington lock slot, VGA, USB 2.0, and then a full-size SD card reader there, which is actually really nice to see. And then along the back, we have absolutely nothing. Let's go ahead and disassemble this. We will need a Phillips screwdriver, and we'll need to undo all the screws on the bottom of the case. All right, with all those screws spun out, we're going to tip that over. Some of these may be captive, may not be. Now, to get in, there is a gap right here in the hinge, and I'm going to start with a plastic pry tool, in this case a credit card, see if I can sneak it underneath the deck of the machine, and then that produces a gap here along the back, which I can slip another card into, and those clips just want to come undone. Okay, there we go. Needed some wiggle and jiggle, but we got it free. All right, so let's take a look at the inside of this. We have a socketed Wi-Fi card hanging out over here. We have our cooling solution sucking in air from the bottom, blowing it out the back. Two RAM slots, as I said earlier. We do have a 2280 NVMe housed over here. We do have the smaller battery present here, and if I had to take a guess, your larger battery, if it were present, would probably encroach on your hard disk drive bay located right here. Now, just taking a quick look at the connectors, we do see an HDD2 port here. So I suspect that with a kit, you might actually be able to run 2 drives in here. It just wouldn't be configured from the factory that way. We also have a massive dead space in here because the board obviously is on the side of the machine. And then we just have 2 separate boards here, oddly enough. One for the VGA, which is off on its own, and then we have one for the USB and the card reader off by itself as well. So that's kind of interesting that they're doing that. The only thing I can think of is that these are cheaper if you're manufacturing them by the tens of thousands rather than making a combo board for this specific machine. At least that's my guess. We do see a few other connectors not used. This one isn't used. And this is probably, if it says FP1, so I'm going to guess that could be fingerprint reader that this is not equipped with. And then moving over here, this is marked key BBL, so that's probably for the backlight, which is not equipped, and that would make sense because that's your keyboard connector over here, usually the wider rimmed one. Overall, not a terribly shabby machine. We do see a metal reinforcement over here for the USB Type-C port, which is kind of neat, rather than relying on the plastic case to do all the heavy lifting. So removal of the trackpad, of course, would involve a removal of the battery here. And removal of the keyboard, if it's possible, which it may not be, it might be plastic riveted into place to the top case, is going to be done by taking literally everything out of this machine. But my gut says that it is plastic welded in there just based on what I'm seeing. So this thing is outfitted with 16 gigs of RAM and 256 gigabyte SSD. So boot time should be pretty darn good, even if the CPU may be a bit anemic. Now, there is one interesting thing to note, and that is I ran the service tag on the back of this plate. The original configuration for this machine actually says that it's a Japanese model, but the keyboard is not Japanese, and you can tell because the spacebar is a normal size and there's no other characters that would indicate it. So either this plate is wrong and it's from a much nicer machine, or the keyboard has been swapped or the motherboard's been swapped. The only way we're going to find out the answers to these questions is by turning it on, which could be said of all Dells. So let's get it back together and do exactly that. With all the screws back in the bottom, let's flip this over and start it up and see what we get for boot times. And what is the real CPU? All right, boot times are pretty good. Keyboard's nothing to write home about. Okay, it is definitively an i3-8145U, 16 gigs of RAM, no pen or touch available for the display, and this is the 1366 by 768 panel. So, with the exception of the RAM, this is pretty bottom barrel, but that being said, you can probably score these for about $200 or less American. One thing that is worth pointing out with a low resolution panel and an i3 CPU is your battery life is going to be fantastic. It's a plastic 15-inch laptop with a numpad that will run Windows 11 pretty comfortably, as you can see, especially with that 16 gigs of RAM. Personally, I wouldn't put more in there for an i3, but you can definitely get these in some i7 higher-end configurations with the NVIDIA GPU, which would mean that they're a pretty decent buy. I wouldn't really want to walk into one of these lower-end ones, only because you can get the much higher-end ones for a little bit more money, albeit in a plastic case. Like, there's no carbon reinforced parts here, magnesium, it's all plastic, and you're paying for that. You're paying primarily for the parts. So I hope you enjoyed this quick look at what is a pretty inexpensive but entirely serviceable computer, especially with the announcement of Windows 10 being sunsetted in the upcoming years. Having something even basic like this that'll run Windows 11 into the next generation of upgrades and OSs is certainly a good thing. Let me know what you think in the comments section down below, and as always, I hope you enjoyed the video. All the YouTube stuff is over here, and I'll see you next time.